Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, ADA and Paratransit. The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and is not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in accordance with law sans the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Melissa will discuss what is ADA Paratransit, who is eligible, eligibility decisions, appeals process, service criteria, and provision of service. To give you a little background about our presenter, Melissa Gemelli is a Director of Paratransit Services for the Lehigh and Northampton Transportation Authority. She has 19 years of experience in providing paratransit under ADA and other Pennsylvania-funded programs. She is responsible for policy development, program monitoring, and outreach. Ms. Gemelli is also responsible for ensuring LANTA's compliance with the paratransit rules and regulations issued by the Federal Transit Administration, the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services, the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, and various local government agencies. Ms. Gemelli was instrumental in designing and implementing LANTA's in-person fundamental assessment program, which is used to independently assess individuals' function abilities to use LANTA's fixed route service. Melissa is also a certified public accountant and chartered global management accountant. Attendees who require a passcode, the word for today is paratransit. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list at the widget at the bottom of your screen. Please note that Melissa will be answering all questions at the end of this program. Thank you all for attending today. Melissa, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending today. I'm going to be covering the ADA regulations and how they relate to paratransit. What is ADA Paratransit? So the ADA regulations require all public transit agencies that provide fixed route services to provide a complimentary service for people with disabilities that prevent them from using the bus. The paratransit service, it's still public transportation, and it's comparable to the level of service provided to individuals without disabilities who use the fixed route service. So if you live in a very rural area of your county and there is no fixed route service, you would not be entitled to ADA paratransit service because, again, you're only eligible for the same service that a person who would be using the fixed route would. ADA paratransit, it's a shared ride service, so it's not a taxi service. It's not a single use. You're most likely not going to be picked up and delivered right to your destination. You will be picking up and dropping off people along the way. And ADA paratransit is not medical transportation. Even though a lot of people use the transportation to get to medical appointments, it's not medical. So the majority of drivers will not perform any first aid. In a medical emergency, they're going to stop the van or the vehicle that they're driving, and they'll call 911. And also, you could not travel in a stretcher. You have to be able to be seated in an upright position, whether it's in the chair, the seat on the van, or if you're using a mobility device, your mobility device has to be able to be secured. So who's eligible for paratransit? Eligibility is directly related to your functional ability. So it's based on your functional ability to use the fixed route. If you can't use the fixed route because of a physical, cognitive, or mental disability, you would be eligible for paratransit. Eligibility is not diagnosis-based or disability-based. So you may have a disability, say a Social Security disability, or you may have a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, for example. But just because you have that diagnosis or you have, a Social Security disability and you're collecting disability benefits, that doesn't automatically qualify you to use paratransit. It's really based on your functional ability to use the bus. Eligibility is not based on the type of mobility aids that an individual uses. So again, just because an individual may use a wheelchair or may use a scooter, that doesn't necessarily entitle them to paratransit. And the reason for that is a lot of today's vehicles, fixed route buses, for example, they can accommodate a wheelchair. So if your fixed route service has a wheelchair ramp or a lift on it, you may not qualify for paratransit. Eligibility in most cases is not based on age, income, or your driving ability. So for example, if you have epilepsy and your driver's license has been revoked, that again will not automatically qualify you for paratransit services. So the ADA regulations have three categories of eligibility. The first is the inability to navigate the fixed route system independently. The second category is people who need an accessible bus or train. And then the third category is people who have a specific disability-related condition. So the first category, and I have the actual cited regulations here, but it's an individual who has a disability who's unable, as a result of that disability, or without the assistance of another individual, to board, ride, or disembark from any vehicle on the system which is readily available to and usable by individuals with disabilities. So some examples of that. Someone may have a cognitive disability that prevents them from using the fixed route system. Their cognitive disability might cause them not to be able to understand or remember or perform some of the actions necessary to plan out and use the fixed route services. So they might be able to board a bus, but they might not be able to plan out their route, or they might not remember to transfer at a specific spot, or they might not remember their stop. Or the individual might not be oriented to person, place, or time. Time is a big factor with people with cognitive disabilities. They may know how to perform all the steps, but they might not know I have to be at the bus stop at 5 o'clock to get that bus. An individual might have the functional ability to use a single route, but they can't make complex trips that require transfers or might require waiting times at a transit station, for example. Another example are people with visual impairments. They might not be able to navigate complex transit stations. We found that individuals with significant psychiatric disabilities might not be able to perform all the tasks. For example, someone with a severe anxiety disorder, they might get overwhelmed by the number of people on the bus, or overwhelmed with all the tasks involved in using the fixed route bus, and they can't concentrate. Or another example, a person with a physical disability, they can ride the bus when they're able to sit, but they can't be guaranteed that they're going to get a seat all the time. And then a final example, people whose medications might affect their balance or their memories or other functional abilities. The second category of eligibility is the lack of accessible vehicles, stations, or bus stops. And again, I have all of the legislation here, but basically it's anybody who needs the assistance of a wheelchair or another boarding assistance device such as a lift to be able to board the bus, ride the bus, or get off the bus. and they want to travel on a route where during regular operations, that type of vehicle is not available. So again, some examples, an accessible bus service. A bus route is considered accessible under this category when all of the buses scheduled on the route are accessible. So for example, up until 2001, I believe it was, LANTA has a fleet of 83 fixed route buses. And up until 2001, not all of those buses were accessible. Not all of them had a ramp that could be deployed, or not all of them had a kneeling bus feature that the bus will pull up to the curb and it'll kind of lower itself so that people who can't climb higher steps, that they'd be able to get on. So people who needed an accessible bus at all times were assigned eligibility under this category because we were not providing accessible buses at every time of the day on every route. Another example would be bus stop accessibility. If there's a destination or there's a bus stop that we can't deploy the wheelchair ramp or we can't kneel the bus, again, those people would be deemed eligible under this category because we would not be able to accommodate them because the stop is inaccessible. And then the third category is the inability to reach a boarding point or a final destination. So a person might have a disability and they're able to use the bus, but they can't get to the bus or they can't get off the bus. So some examples of this, someone who has an ambulatory disability, they use crutches or they use a wheelchair, but they can't navigate over cracked sidewalks, or maybe there is no sidewalk and they would have to travel along a lawn or along the street. They would be granted eligibility under this category. Another category or another example, people with asthma who have to walk several blocks to a bus stop in extreme heat. The extreme heat might cause their asthma to flare. So in severe heat, they'd be granted eligibility under this category. But maybe in normal weather conditions or cooler temperatures, they're able to, so they wouldn't be eligible. So the eligibility determination process, every transit system is required to have a process for determining ADA paratransit eligibility. And I will tell you they vary from each system. Pennsylvania has 63 transit agencies, and every single one of them has a different determination process. But they do have to contain certain elements in order to determine eligibility. The most important thing is that the process has to limit eligibility, ADA eligibility, to individuals who meet the eligibility criteria. And generally the process includes information from paper applications, responses to interview questions, information provided by qualified professionals such as a doctor or a caseworker, and then from assessments of functional abilities. LANTA in 2011 started performing in-person assessments. So we gather information about the person's disability on a paper application, and then we meet with those riders and we actually do testing. So for a physical disability, we would walk the individual through all of the steps that they would have to complete to use the fixed route. For people with cognitive disabilities, we actually have a test, and it really centers on safety skills and time management and awareness. And that's how we determine cognitive disability. And then for people with mental health disabilities, we have a questionnaire that we send to the person's psychiatrist or psychologist or intensive case manager to complete so that we have enough information about whether that person has the skills to use the fixed route service. Eligibility determinations, they have to be timely. The regulations state that decisions have to be made within 21 days of submission of a complete application. If an eligibility decision is not rendered within 21 days, the applicant has to be given service. They're deemed eligible until and unless the entity denies the application. All eligibility decisions must be in writing. If they're deemed ineligible, the written notice has to give them reasons for being determined ineligible, and then they also have to be given a copy of the appeals process. So for example, LANTA, when we determine eligibility, we send a letter and we say, you know, you've been granted these categories of eligibility. You know, you can only ride on certain days or in certain temperatures. And then we also send them a copy of the in-person assessment, and we send them a copy of the appeals process. So the types of eligibility that people can get, there's three types in the regulations. The first is unconditional. It's unrestricted or basically all trip eligibility, which means that the individual can never use fixed route services under any circumstances, so they can always use paratransit. Second category of eligibility is conditional eligibility. This is trip-by-trip eligibility, and it means that the individual might be able to use the bus for some trips, but might not be able to use it for others. The example that I gave previously, a person with asthma, for example, they might not be able to use the fixed route services when it's very hot, but they might be able to use the fixed route services when it's cool. So their eligibility might be something like you can use paratransit when the temperature is 80 degrees or higher. And then there's the third category is temporary eligibility, and it's for a specific time period based on their disability. A great example is someone who's undergoing chemotherapy treatments, and they'll be too tired to walk to or from a fixed route bus stop. Or another one is a person who had knee replacement surgery that they might only need the service for 3 months while they're recuperating, and then they won't need it anymore. So just some general eligibility considerations. Again, it's based on the independent ability of the individual, not the availability of other individuals who might travel with the passenger. So you may have someone who travels with you that if that person were traveling with you, maybe you would be oriented to time, or you wouldn't get lost in a transit station. But again, the eligibility is based on the individual's ability, not somebody who might be riding with you. Eligibility is based on your current functional ability, so it's not based on your past, and it's not based on your future. So if you apply for the service and say, I'm going to be getting a knee replacement surgery in 6 months, so once I have my knee replaced, I'm going to need the service in 6 months, you most likely will be denied when you first apply, and you would have to reapply when you have the surgery. Eligibility is based on your most limiting condition, so you might have a physical, a cognitive, and a mental health disability. So it's really the worst one. So if your cognitive disability prevents you, that you get lost and you have poor safety skills, your mental health disability, really just you're depressed, you might feel a little sad some days. And then your physical disability is just that, you know, maybe you have an arm issue. It would be based on the cognitive disability because that's the one that impairs your functional ability to use the fixed route the most. And then eligibility is based on the mobility aid that the individual says he or she will use. So if there's if they are using a wheelchair all of the time, but they come to the in-person assessment and they don't bring their wheelchair with them, we would say, well, it's going to be based on your wheelchair. So if you can't complete all the functional steps of using a fixed route because you don't have your wheelchair, your eligibility won't be determined at that point. We'll say come back when you have your wheelchair with you. The regulations also state that the agencies have to have an administrative appeals process for people who are denied eligibility. And that does include people who are determined to be conditionally eligible or eligible on a temporary basis. There's a written notice that has to be sent that gives notice of the appeal's rights and also the instructions on how to request an appeal. And that has to be sent with the eligibility determinations. Agencies have to accept all appeal requests received within 60 days of the initial determination. If an appeal is received outside of that 60 days, the agency has the discretion to deny that appeal. During the appeals process, assuming that the appeal was received within the 60 days, the agency does not have to provide paratransit service to that person until the appeal determination is rendered. Agencies have to reach a decision on the appeal within 30 days of the receipt, or if they don't, if they're still looking into it, they have to provide paratransit services after 30 days until they decide the appeal. The regulations do allow agencies to recertify, and that can be done at regular, reasonable intervals because there's a lot of factors that could change the ability of individuals to use fixed route services. Disabilities could improve, they could get worse, mobility devices could change. The law doesn't give a reasonable time, but generally the Federal Transit Administration says between every 3 and 4 years. So what LANTA does is every 4 years we have individuals basically reapply for the service. And based on their new application, we'll review it to see if anything has changed. If the person has, for example, a cognitive disability that will never improve and has not improved, we may not have them go for another functional assessment. We may just grant them another 3 or 4 years of eligibility. But there may be individuals that might have been using a wheelchair when they came into the system and when they received ADA eligibility, and now they're using a cane. So those are people that we might want to put through another functional assessment. So the service criteria. The regulations, again, they state that people with disabilities are entitled to comparable service to the fixed route service. So there's a whole bunch of criteria. The service area, agencies have to provide paratransit service to origins and destinations that are within corridors within 3/4 of a mile on each side of the fixed route. Some agencies go beyond that. They might shrink that and say we'll go, enlarge that, and they might say we'll provide it to people up to a mile from a fixed route, but it really is, the law says 3/4 of a mile. Service hours have to be the exact same service hours as the fixed route. But I will say that those can vary. For example, LANTA has several core trunk routes that have service from 5 in the morning until midnight. And then it has other routes that might only operate during the regular workday, say 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. ADA service would only be available on those kind of non-trunk services from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And then on the trunk services, it would be available from 5 to midnight. So it's the service hours are based on the actual fixed route that you would use if you were able to. The service type, at a minimum, the service has to be curb to curb. And again, it's looking at fixed route bus service is curb to curb. So that's the minimum. A lot of agencies will provide a different level of service. For example, LANTA provides front door to front door service. So we may bring you to the hospital and we'll bring you right up to, we'll walk you or push your wheelchair up to the front door of the hospital, but we won't take you inside of the hospital to different rooms or different offices. Service requests. Agencies can permit reservations up to 14 days in advance of the desired trip, but the trip has to be scheduled by at least the end of the business day before the desired trip. So, for example, LANTA accepts calls up until 4:30 the day before the service. Someone could call and request a trip at 4:25 today or an 8 o'clock tomorrow morning trip, and we would have to try and accommodate that. Reservation hours. We have to make reservation services during normal business hours, and we have to have reservation services available during times when the agency offices aren't open the day before service. So an example of this is LANTA does not have reservation services on Saturdays or Sundays, but we do have someone who monitors the answering machines, and we will accommodate those services. If somebody calls on Saturday and they want to book a Sunday trip, we have the availability to do that. We just don't maybe have a live person who's able to do that. Negotiating trip times. We can negotiate pickup times with the individuals. So if somebody says, I want to be dropped off at work at 8 o'clock, and based on all of the other trips that are already in the system, we're not able to accommodate an exact 8 o'clock. We might be able to say to you, we can't drop you off at 8, but we can drop you off at 7:30. We're allowed to do that an hour before or after the desired time. Anything beyond that is technically considered a trip denial. There is a fare associated with paratransit services, and it can't be more than twice the fare that would be paid to use the fixed route service. So for example, if it costs $3 to use the fixed route service and you have to transfer buses and that costs you $1, that's a $4 fixed route bus ride. The paratransit fare can't be more than $8 for that trip. There are no trip purpose restrictions. And also, most importantly, there are no priorities. So if a person calls and they want to go to the movies at 8 in the morning, for example, and someone calls at the same time and needs to go for chemotherapy at 8 in the morning, if the person who called for the movies calls before the person who tried to reserve a trip to go to chemotherapy, it's first come, first served. So even though a lot of people, and myself included, a chemotherapy trip might be life-sustaining and a movie trip really isn't, the ADA does not look at trip purposes. So it's first come, first served. If the agency can accommodate both trips, great. If they can't, they would have to negotiate one or maybe both of those trips. The regulations say that the agency can't have any capacity constraints. So we can't limit the availability of paratransit service for ADA eligible individuals based on the number of trips that they want. We can't restrict that. We can't have waiting lists for access to the service. And then there's some operational patterns or practices that ADA specifically excludes, and that the Federal Transit Administration, when they do audits of systems, they do look at this. There can't be a significant number of untimely pickups for the initial or the return trips. There can't be a substantial number of trip denials or missed trips, or a substantial number of trips with excessive trip lengths. A very important feature of paratransit is on-time performance, and it's more than just ensuring that trips that we picked you up on time. It's making sure that we get you to your destination on time. And it's also not just being late. It also includes very early pickups or drop-offs. Pattern of early and or late trips, it indicates a capacity constraint, which basically means we don't have enough vans on the street to deliver all of the service, the demands for the services. It's an industry standard to view on-time pickup as vehicle arrival within an on-time window established by the agency. The industry standard is a 30-minute window. For example, LANTA's is 15 minutes on either side of the time that we said we were going to pick you up. Some agencies might say it's 30 minutes before, or some might say it's 20 minutes before and 10 minutes after. But riders need to be ready during that pickup window. And the way that LANTA works that is we give you a pickup time of 5 o'clock. You know that we can arrive between 4:45 and 5:15. You have to be ready to board the van during that time period. If we arrive at 4:45, we will wait 5 minutes, and then if you're not on board, we can leave, and that's considered a no-show. Here's an example of on-time performance. You want to be dropped off at the doctor's office at 9. The scheduling software says that you're going to be picked up at 7:42. We tell you that. We have the window of 15 minutes. So we arrive at 7:30. The van is considered on time, even though we did pick you up 12 minutes before the negotiated time. It is within that window. If the passenger doesn't board the van by 7:35, we're allowed to leave, and the passenger is marked a no-show. Again, just to reiterate, agencies can negotiate pickup times with the passengers, but we can't require passengers to schedule a trip more than an hour before or after they want to be picked up. So if a person needs a ride home from work and they end work at 5, they want to be picked up at 5:15, we could negotiate a 6:15 pickup with them, but we couldn't say we want to pick you up at 4:45, and we also couldn't say we're going to pick you up at 6:45. If the negotiated pickup time that we give you changes, we do have to notify you of that. And again, just some other notes. Most trips, the on-time drop-off is more important than the on-time pickup. So a person might not care that we were 15 minutes late picking them up in the morning to go to work, as long as they got to work on time. And again, FTA has not specified the drop-off window, but in numerous compliance reviews that they've done, any trips that are more than 30 minutes early, they consider those significantly early, and they consider those impediments to using the service. You know, that if we're consistently getting you to work 45 minutes early, you might not want to use the service anymore. Trip lengths on paratransit have to be equivalent to the same trip on the fixed route. So the fixed route travel time is calculated as the actual time that it would take you on the bus, and then also the time that you would spend walking to your bus stop to board the bus, and then walking from the bus stop to your destination, and then also the time waiting for the bus. So if you have a transfer and you have to wait 20 minutes in the transit station, that would be included as well. FTA does not define equivalency. They just look at, is it pretty close? There have been a lot of reviews, and some of the reviews, some of the agencies have been able to say that 1.5 times the fixed route equivalent is what we use, and FTA has said that works for us. Others have said, you know, we're using 15 minutes over the fixed route equivalent, and FTA says no, it has to be the exact same. So it does depend on, you know, the opinion of the reviewer at the time, but I will tell you that LANTA does look at it in terms of what is the exact fixed route equivalent, and then we monitor any trips that exceed that fixed route equivalent just to see if there's anything that can be done to make it a shorter trip. For the provision of service, the entity has to maintain operational facilities and vehicles that make them accessible. So for example, a ramp leading into a transit station that has to be maintained and operational at all times. Vehicle ramps or vehicle lifts have to be operational at all times. Accessibility features, again, the lifts, the ramps, or securement devices on the vans, they have to be repaired promptly. And then we have to make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities who might use those features. And again, it's the same for the buses. So if we have a bus that the lift breaks after we drop somebody off, and then at the next stop, somebody wants to get on who's using a wheelchair who needs that ramp or that lift, we wouldn't be able to take them, but we would have to make arrangements for another bus or another vehicle to pick that person up. And then we do have to repair them pretty quickly. And then all agencies have to have a preventive maintenance schedule to ensure that the accessibilities are working, you know, properly. LANTA does that there's a certain mileage or a certain length of time, you know, whichever comes first. And in addition to doing routine things like changing all the fluids and oil changes and checking the tires, those kinds of things, we also will look at seat belts, wheelchair securement, ties. We test the ramps, the lifts, all of those kinds of things. Common wheelchairs have to be transported on all paratransit service. There is the definition from the regulations. It's a mobility aid that has either 3 or 4 wheels. It's usable indoors. It's designed for and used by individuals with mobility impairments, and it's whether it's manual or powered. A common wheelchair does not exceed 30 inches in width, 48 inches in length, and it doesn't weigh more than 600 pounds when occupied. There are some exceptions to this. I mean, this is just kind of the base. For example, LANTA's vans, we can accommodate people whose wheelchairs, when occupied, weigh up to 800 pounds, so we could transport people. But if there's a wheelchair that doesn't fit into the footprint of the common wheelchair area on the van, we may not be able to accommodate those people. So in summary, people with disabilities, they're entitled to the same level of public transportation services that are available to the general public. Eligibility is related to their functional ability, not based on a disability or a diagnosis. Paratransit is not medical transportation. Trip lengths are equivalent to the fixed route, and there are no direct trips. Paratransit service is at a minimum curb to curb, and again, there are no priorities based on disability or trip purpose. Each trip purpose is handled in the exact same manner. I know we're done a little bit early, but if there are any questions, and I do, in one of the slides here, I do cite the sources that are available on the internet to give you more information if you're interested. Pretty dry reading, but if you're looking for the answer to a specific question, you may find it there.
Thank you, Melissa. And if all the attendees can enter in the passcode, which is Paratransit, and any questions that you may have. Our first question, why do the regs require the service to be complimentary?
Again, it's getting back to the ADA regulations. They are a civil right, and the complimentary service, it's people with disabilities are entitled to the same service that an individual without a disability is. So if an individual without a disability can get a bus to work, the individual with a disability should be able to get the same services. So that's why it's considered complimentary. And again, it's the same service, the same routes, the same length of time, everything that relates to complimentary service.
Next question. What are the paratransit policies requirements for private transportation companies?
I go over the public here. Private transit systems are not held to the same standards. And if you have a specific question about that, there is information in the regulations about the private companies.
Next question, what if the user refuses to allow securement with the vehicle's restraints?
If an agency's policy is that all riders must use some kind of securement, then that rider must allow their wheelchair or their mobility device to be secured. So for example, on LANTA vans, every passenger has to ride with a seatbelt. It's not negotiable. So in that case, a person who's using a wheelchair would have to be secured. If they refused on our service, they would be denied that trip. If an agency does not require the use of seatbelts, then the person who uses a wheelchair actually does have the right to not be secured.
Next question. What is the duty of the operator to assist a blind client from door to door?
Again, it depends on the agency's policies. ADA's minimum requirement is curb to curb. So a person with a visual impairment who's using a system that is curb to curb, the driver has no responsibility to walk them to the door. In the LANTA service area, we are door to door. Our drivers have a responsibility to go to the client's, the rider's door in the morning to escort them to the van. And then when we arrive at the destination, the driver has a responsibility to walk the rider to the front door. So if a person is going to a medical building, for example, we only walk the consumer to the front door. We will not walk inside with them and take them, to the third floor of of the medical facility to their doctor's office. And that's where personal care attendants come into play. People who can't use the system independently, who may need a higher level of service, such as an individual with a visual impairment. The regulations do allow the person to travel with a personal care attendant, and that's somebody who performs some function for the person. So for example, with the person with a visual disability, that person is basically their eyes for them. The regulations require that personal care attendant travel at no cost, and basically the law treats them as a mobility device, just as they would treat a wheelchair or a cane. So that's why they get to ride for free. But the personal care attendant has to be performing some type of service to help the person with a disability use the van service or ambulate beyond the van into the building.
Next question, is Uber ever used as paratransit?
Some systems across the country are using Uber. It's kind of a mixed bag. The state of Pennsylvania has looked into it, and LANTA specifically. One of the things that we struggle with is there are not always the same insurance requirements that we have. There may not be the same background checks. I know that Uber does check the driving records, but they may not be performing some of the in-depth criminal and child abuse clearances that we're checking. Their equipment may not always be accessible, and one of the concerns that we have is guaranteeing that when that vehicle accepts that trip, that it is accessible. And then the final thing that we're really struggling with is Uber drivers have the ability to decline a trip. So our concern is what happens if somebody doesn't want to go into downtown at 11 o'clock at night and they hit decline on that trip. How then do we make sure that consumer gets the trip?
Next question, can an agency deny ADA eligibility based upon the failure of an individual to mitigate the effects of their condition, i.e., an individual with a mental impairment who refuses or is otherwise non-compliant with taking medications or otherwise comply with medical directives?
Basically, no. Again, it's based on the most limiting condition. So if a person with a mental health issue, mental health disability, declines to take medication, again, the law can't force them in most cases to take medication. So because their disability at the time they're evaluated, they're not compliant with their medications, and their disability at that point in time when they're evaluated shows that they can't use fixed route independently, they would be granted eligibility. So it can't be based on anything that they do not to mitigate their condition, whether it's medication. Or another thing that we run into quite frequently is we have consumers with mobility issues that they might be using a walker, for example, and boy, they really should most likely be using some kind of wheelchair or a scooter because they're a fall risk or that kind of thing. We can't force them to use that. So if they decide that they don't even want to use a walker, we have to give them eligibility.
Next question, how many days before an appointment do you have to apply for approval, and what happens when it is urgent?
The urgency comes into play. It's basically up to the agency's discretion. LANTA does not prioritize. So the sooner you know that you might need the service, the better off you are. The regulations state that we have 21 days after we receive a completed application, and the application includes the functional assessment. So you might send in an application today, but you didn't complete your assessment until, for 3 more days. Your 21 days doesn't start until that assessment is completed. Some agencies, and again, for example, LANTA might look at it that it's a life-sustaining treatment, so it might be dialysis and chemotherapy. We might allow ADA eligibility for those purposes, but if it's just for a routine medical appointment, we don't have to grant that.
Next question, what remedies are available if an individual is repeatedly denied paratransit services?
Again, that depends on the agency's appeals process, but generally there are either 1 or 2 levels of appeals to the agency itself. So for example, at LANTA, our program manager assigns eligibility. The first level of appeals comes to me. The second level of appeals goes to our executive director. And then the third level of appeals is an administrative appeal. And that is someone from the agency side, someone from the consumer side, and then a third sort of mutually agreeable individual, but someone who's familiar with that type of disability. So one that we've been involved with more recently is someone in the mental health, someone who has a mental health disability that we may have denied full eligibility. We may have said it was conditional. The consumer disputed that. We had to get someone from the mental health community to review it with us and then determine eligibility. And then I guess the final thing would be, too, if you exhaust all of those appeals, you can file a complaint with FTA and their Office of Civil Rights.
Next question. Is there a requirement for vehicles to be accessible for those using wheelchairs or scooters that are larger than common wheelchairs?
No, there is not. Basically, the mobility device has to fit in the footprint. But like I said earlier, there may be exceptions. For example, even though the definition says 600 pounds, we can accommodate up to 800 pounds, and we do. If we know that, a certain scooter, we've had certain wheelchairs that they might be, a tad bigger than the footprint, we still might be able to accommodate them. But there is no requirement to accommodate a mobility device that does not meet the common requirements or the conditions you're able to accommodate. We recently had a gentleman who, when he started using our service, he and his wheelchair, the combined weight was 600 pounds. He went for a recertification 4 years later, and now the combined weight, he changed to one of these really heavy-duty multifunction wheelchairs, the combined weight is 960 some pounds. We can't accommodate that, so he is denied service.
Next question. What are common reasons for denial? Example, insufficient medical documentation?
Not necessarily. Again, it's based on, first of all, the agency and how their application is set up. But the reason for denial is always based on the individual's functional disability. An example of that is we recently had a case where an individual had a prosthetic arm and he was receiving Social Security disability benefit, but he had no disability that prevented him from using a fixed route bus because he had one arm that he could use to pay the fare or to show the driver his fare card. He was able to perform all of the functions needed to use the fixed route bus, so he was denied. That's a pretty drastic example, but there are others that, you know, a person with a diagnosis of depression, again, they might be receiving Social Security benefits because of depression, but the doctor fills out the questionnaire and doesn't indicate how the person's depression stops them from using the bus. And that's really what it's all about. From the application process through your final appeal, you really have to make sure that whatever documentation you're submitting to the transit agency documents what your disability is, and most importantly, how it prevents you from using the fixed route and why you need paratransit. Simply having your doctor say you have a disability and you need the paratransit van, that is not sufficient.
Next question. You mentioned that PA has 63 separate transit agencies. What efforts, if any, do these agencies make to communicate with each other?
We do communicate a lot. Pennsylvania actually has 3 other programs that fund paratransit services. So we do communicate. We meet a lot. We do have a state transit association, and we do, you know, provide a lot of feedback to each other. But unfortunately, each transit agency is established by, in most cases, the counties, and they're operating under separate bylaws. So there could be different requirements as long as they're meeting the bare minimum of the law. In Pennsylvania, there's only 3 authorities that do in-person assessments. It's SEPTA, which is the Philadelphia region, Port Authority, which is Pittsburgh, and then the Lehigh Valley, which is the Allentown, Bethlehem, and Easton. There are other agencies who have in-depth questionnaires, and then there are other agencies that just say, have the doctor sign off that you have a disability that prevents you from using the bus. There are some efforts being made to try to standardize some of this, but that's a relatively new endeavor, and we're really struggling with what does each agency need to make that eligibility determination.
And our last question, are there any requirements of drivers to ensure that a rider's seatbelt on a wheelchair is secured while riding in the wheelchair itself is secured?
Yes, the driver is...
Are there any...
Okay. Bad.
I was just going to repeat the question if you didn't understand it.
No, I think I did.
Okay.
The driver, yeah, the driver, when he loads the wheelchair, he will secure it, or he or she will secure, there are straps that attach to, I know I'm going to mess this up, but there are certain attachment points on the wheelchair itself. And then LANTA actually has like a lap / seatbelt, and the driver is required to, secure the passenger with that. But I will tell you, it's the driver's responsibility to drive. So if the person were to remove the seatbelt while the driver is driving, the driver might not realize it until they look to load or, debark somebody, and then they would say to the person, you have to secure it again. I hope that answered that.
Thanks, Melissa. Please note that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must have attended for the full 60 minutes of this presentation. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Melissa Gemelli for her time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Melissa, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case that you're working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. One of my colleagues will be following up with you regarding your feedback on today's presentation. Again, thank you all for attending. This concludes our program for today.